Picture this. You are a foreign ambassador in 1665. A man chosen to represent your king at one of the grandest courts in Europe. You arrive in Madrid, the glittering capital of the Spanish Empire. A city whose very air seems heavy with incense, gold, and the weight of centuries. As you walk through the labyrinthine corridors of the Alcazar Palace, you brace yourself for the presence of majesty. Spain, after all, is not merely another kingdom. It is an empire that stretches from the silver mines of Peru to the spice islands of the Philippines. From the Low Countries to the vast plains of Castile. This is the beating heart of Christendom, the seat of the Habsburgs, and at its summit sits the King of Spain. The most Catholic monarch in the world. You expect grandeur. You expect magnificence. You expect a man whose very presence embodies power. But when the throne room doors open, what you encounter is not majesty, it is horror. The figure before you cannot close his mouth. His jaw hangs loose and heavy, like the broken hinge of a door. When he tries to speak, the sounds are garbled, wet, almost inhuman. His body is twisted, frail, and grotesque. His courtiers whisper behind fans and folded hands, calling him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. But no one dares to speak these words aloud. For Charles II of Spain is not the victim of sorcery or devils, as many in his kingdom believe. He is the product of something far more terrifying, his own family. The truth is this: Charles II was not cursed by witches but by the Habsburg dynasty itself. For more than 2 centuries, the Habsburgs had ruled half the known world. They wore crowns in Spain, Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, and the Netherlands. They presided over an empire upon which, quite literally, the sun never set. But behind the splendor and the Catholic pomp lay a dark obsession, an obsession with blood. Not metaphorical blood, but the literal flow of genes from one royal womb to another. The Habsburgs had convinced themselves that their bloodline was sacred, almost divine. To preserve it, they practiced what they called purity of blood. In their eyes, it wasn't enough to marry nobles or royals. The family circle had to close tighter. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. Generations collapsed into each other until the family tree resembled not a tree at all, but a grotesque knot of tangled branches, looping endlessly back upon themselves. Consider this. Charles II's inbreeding coefficient was calculated at 0.254. To modern ears, that number might not mean much, but scientists explain it plainly. It is higher than if his parents had been brother and sister. This was not a single accident of incest but the result of 11 consecutive generations of intermarriage. Normally, a child has 16 great-grandparents. Charles had only 6. His ancestors appear in his lineage over and over again in different roles, as if the same names had been shuffled in an endless game of genetic cards. Anna of Austria, for instance, was not only his grandmother but also his aunt and his great-grandmother. Philip II, one of Spain's most powerful kings, was his grandfather, his great-grandfather, and his great-great-grandfather. It was as if the Habsburgs had designed a web rather than a family tree, a spider's trap woven with their own blood. And Charles II was the fly caught at its center. Modern geneticists confirm what the courtiers whispered in dread. Charles II had less genetic diversity than a child born to full siblings. His very DNA had been strangled by centuries of Habsburg arrogance. And this was no accident. The family knew the risks. Advisors warned as early as the 16th century that too much endogamy, marriage within the same kin, would produce weak and sickly children. Physicians documented miscarriages, stillbirths, and deformities among royal infants. But the response of the dynasty was chilling. They did not pull back. They doubled down. Why? Because to marry outside the family was to risk diluting their sacred blood. To them, ruling the greatest empire on earth was less dangerous than the idea of letting lesser blood into their veins. And so, generation after generation, they sacrificed the health of their children for the illusion of power. The Habsburg jaw, the grotesque protruding chin that became infamous in portraits, was not simply a family trait. It was a warning sign, a visible scar of centuries of inbreeding. Yet even as it worsened with each new heir, the dynasty clung to its superstition of purity. By the time Charles II was born in 1661, The empire was already crumbling under the weight of this obsession. Spain's armies were losing battles they once easily won. The silver from the New World was vanishing into the pockets of bankers. Famine and plague stalked the cities. But perhaps the greatest omen of Spain's decline came not from its armies or its economy, but from its nursery, when the midwives lifted the newborn prince and unwrapped the royal swaddling cloths. They did not cheer. They gasped. His head was far too large, his body frail, his eyes wide-set and strange. Worst of all, his mouth hung permanently ajar, as if mocking the very idea of speech. Some whispered that the child was stillborn, others that he had been touched by the devil. Few realized that they were witnessing something far more tragic, the natural conclusion of centuries of arrogance written into flesh. The secrecy was immediate. Midwives were threatened with death if they ever spoke of what they saw. Doctors were forced to sign documents declaring the infant perfectly healthy. Portraits of him as a child were destroyed if they revealed too much. Spain, the proudest empire in Christendom, could not admit that its heir was malformed, perhaps broken beyond repair. And so the lie began. The grand illusion that Charles II was merely another royal prince, destined to rule. But behind the closed doors of the Alcazar, reality whispered. Servants crossed themselves before approaching his cradle. Nurses muttered prayers under their breath. Some courtiers claimed to hear strange, choking sounds from the infant's chambers at night. Not quite crying, not quite breathing, as if the child himself hovered between worlds. And so the bewitched king began his journey, not a curse from witches, but a curse written in blood, compounded generation after generation until it culminated in one frail, tragic boy destined to sit upon the mightiest throne in Europe. On November 6, 1661, the bells of Madrid should have rung in celebration. The capital of Spain, weary from war and debt, longed for a moment of joy, and nothing stirred a kingdom more than the birth of a royal heir. But when Charles, Prince of Asturias, entered the world, there was no triumph, no jubilant cries from the midwives. Instead, a hush spread through the royal chambers, a silence so heavy it felt like blasphemy. The infant was alive, but only just. His head appeared swollen and ungainly compared to his frail body. His eyes, set unnaturally far apart, stared blankly into the flickering candlelight. Worst of all, his mouth gaped open in that ghastly, permanent expression that would haunt his every portrait. Some attendants whispered he resembled a corpse more than a prince. Others dared murmur he had been touched by dark forces. But whatever their private thoughts, they knew one thing. Silence was survival. Philip IV, Charles's father, was a monarch obsessed with appearances. The proud Habsburg dynasty could not allow weakness to stain its image. And so, within hours of the child's birth, the truth was buried. Midwives and physicians were sworn to secrecy under penalty of death. Reports were falsified. Official documents declared the infant vigorous and strong. But in the hidden corners of the palace, servants crossed themselves whenever they passed the cradle, muttering prayers as if warding off a demon. In truth, Charles's early years were more a slow torment than a childhood, where most infants raised their heads within months. Charles could not hold his upright until the age of 6. Where most toddlers take their first steps before their second birthday, Charles did not walk until he was 8. By the time other children were learning Latin and swordplay, he was still struggling to form intelligible words. His tongue seemed too large for his mouth, his jaw too misshapen for speech. Courtiers described his utterances as wet, garbled noises, sounds that reminded them less of a child and more of a drowning man. The palace, a place meant to echo with the laughter of royal heirs, was instead filled with unease. Nurses refused to remain alone with him. Some were caught making the sign of the cross when they lifted him from his crib, as if holding something unnatural. Others abandoned their posts entirely, fearing that his condition was a divine punishment, a living curse. There are accounts of guards hearing strange noises at night from the young prince's chamber, not human crying, but choking, gurgling sounds that made even hardened soldiers shiver. And yet, despite his deformities, Charles's presence was too important to hide forever. At the age of 5, court painters were summoned to create his first official portrait. The artist Juan Carreño de Miranda approached the commission with dread, expecting to paint the cherubic face of a royal child. He instead found a figure so disturbing that he nearly refused the task. In letters later discovered, Miranda confessed that the sight of Charles haunted him, giving him nightmares for weeks. Still, duty demanded completion. The painter softened the deformities with brushstrokes, straightened the jaw, brightened the eyes. But even in these flattering images, something was unmistakable. The child's gaze, wide and strangely intelligent, seemed to reveal a trapped soul, aware that he was different. Aware that others feared him, yet unable to understand why. The Spanish court, desperate to maintain the illusion of normalcy, turned Charles's upbringing into a carefully choreographed charade. Ceremonies were staged so his weaknesses would remain hidden. Furniture was arranged to conceal his body. Meals were pre-cut into small pieces, mashed into paste so that he could eat without choking before the eyes of foreign envoys. Every gesture, every public appearance, was calculated to disguise the truth. Spain's air was broken. But children are less easily deceived than adults. When Charles was 7, an Italian ambassador brought his young son to court. At the sight of the Spanish prince, the boy screamed in terror, crying out, "Mostro, mostro, monster," in his native tongue. The echo of that cry rattled the palace like a curse. The incident sparked a diplomatic embarrassment. But more importantly, it shattered whatever illusions remained. Even children could see what the courtiers worked so hard to conceal. This was the reality. Charles II was no ordinary child. He was a living testament to the consequences of centuries of incestuous marriages. His lower jaw jutted grotesquely forward. His teeth did not meet, leaving a permanent gap even when his lips tried to close. He drooled constantly, his chin perpetually dabbed by attendants with cloths. The deformities of his body were matched by the delays of his mind. Tutors compared teaching him to pouring water into a cracked vessel. Knowledge entered but seemed to slip away as quickly as it was given. And yet, the most tragic detail of all may have been his awareness. Accounts from physicians suggest that Charles often wept inconsolably, sometimes for hours, without clear cause, crying. It seemed, not from immediate pain but from a deeper, inexplicable sorrow. Perhaps even as a child he knew, in some wordless way, that he was different, that his body was his prison, that the world around him looked at him not as a prince of Spain, but as something uncanny. The whispers of witchcraft grew louder. The people of Madrid called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. But the true curse had nothing to do with demons. It was written in his blood, inscribed in every malformed bone and twisted joint. A dynasty that once ruled the world had produced an heir who could barely walk, barely speak, barely live, yet Spain clung to him, because it had no choice. The empire's future rested on this fragile, suffering child, this heir who, from the moment of birth, had been chained by his own flesh. By the time Charles II reached his teenage years, the truth could no longer be hidden, not even beneath layers of ceremony and courtly deception. Spain's king was not merely frail, he was a living catalogue of genetic disaster. The most infamous feature was his jaw, known today as the Habsburg jaw. In Charles it had reached an extreme, almost grotesque peak. His lower jaw jutted so far forward that even when his lips were pressed together, a gap remained wide enough to slip a coin through. His teeth never aligned. Eating, something so ordinary for most, became for Charles a humiliating ordeal. He could not chew meat or bread. Palace kitchens had to prepare his meals like baby food, mashed, pureed, softened into mush. Servants stood by at every banquet, dabbing constantly at his mouth as soup dribbled from the corners, or as unchewed fragments fell onto his clothes. Foreign envoys, trained to conceal their emotions, recorded their horror in private letters. The Venetian ambassador compared the king's speech to the gasping of a fish. A French diplomat wrote that dining in Charles's presence was a torment to the stomach. So revolting was the spectacle. Even his allies recoiled. The very moment when kings were expected to project majesty, in the ritual of breaking bread with their peers, became for Charles a public humiliation. The humiliation weighed on him. Records suggest Charles often refused to eat in front of others, preferring to go hungry rather than endure the stares. His malnutrition compounded his frailty. He remained stunted, scarcely taller than 5 feet, his body thin and weak, His limbs spindly, his chest compressed as though crushed inward by unseen hands. His head, oversized in comparison, seemed almost too heavy for his body to support. But his physical deformities were only the beginning. The inbreeding that twisted his body had also shackled his mind. Charles did not walk until he was 8 years old. He did not read until he was 10, and even then with great difficulty. Court tutors described their efforts with despair, like trying to pour wine into a cracked vessel. Knowledge went in, but nothing seemed to stay. At times he appeared no more capable than a child, prone to tantrums and sudden bursts of rage over trivial matters. At others he sank into long, vacant silences, staring at nothing, unresponsive, as if lost in some private void. The contradiction of his mind haunted his tutors. He was not entirely without awareness. In rare lucid moments, Charles himself seemed painfully conscious of his limitations. A surviving letter, written in his shaky hand, confesses, "I am a prisoner in my own flesh, and God has made me king as some cruel jest." That awareness made his suffering all the more poignant. He was not merely deformed, he was trapped. A lucid mind flickering inside a failing vessel. Physicians of the time could offer no real answers. They catalogued his endless ailments, digestive troubles, seizures, rashes, fevers, mysterious pains. They noted his constant exhaustion, his inability to sire children, his bouts of confusion. But the science of genetics was centuries away. To 17th-century medicine, Charles's condition could only be explained in vague terms, imbalances of humors, divine punishment, or, more ominously, the work of sorcery. The Spanish people began to believe what the courtiers whispered. Their king was cursed. His subjects saw his jaw, his twisted body, his vacant mind, and concluded he must be bewitched. The nickname spread across Spain, El Hechizado, the bewitched one. To his people, he was living proof that dark forces walked within the palace. And yet, despite his obvious infirmities, Charles was still the most powerful monarch in Europe, at least in name. Behind the throne, factions of nobles and ministers fought for influence, each using the king's incapacity to push their own agendas. Spain's empire, already cracking under debt and mismanagement, weakened further under this shadow government. Foreign rivals circled like wolves. The empire that once dominated Europe now rested on the shoulders of a man who could barely walk across a room. There is a tragic irony here. The Habsburgs had spent centuries marrying within their own bloodline to preserve their supposed purity, to keep their empire in the hands of the most noble family in Christendom. And yet, this very obsession had birthed Charles II, a king too weak to rule, too broken to continue the dynasty, too frail even to fulfill the most basic duty of monarchy, producing an heir. To foreign eyes, he was not simply a tragic figure. He was a warning. In him they saw the physical embodiment of decline. His body was Spain's empire made flesh, once vast and mighty, now fragile, collapsing, rotting from within. The great Habsburg dream of eternal dominion had culminated not in glory, but in this: a boy who could barely chew his food, a man who shuffled like an old cripple, a monarch mocked by children and feared by his own servants. Charles II was not merely a sick king. He was the death rattle of a dynasty. For centuries, the Habsburgs had defined their power through one word: continuity. Dynasties lived or died on heirs, and the entire future of the Spanish Empire depended on Charles II producing a son. But this was the cruelest irony of all. The king whose very body was broken by centuries of inbreeding could not fulfill the one duty expected of him. His first marriage was to Marie-Louise of Orléans, niece of Louis XIV of France. She was young, vivacious, and by all accounts intelligent. But when she arrived in Madrid, expecting to marry the mightiest king in Europe, what she found was a pale, sickly man with the mind of a child and the body of a dying old man. Their wedding night was a disaster. Servants later whispered that the young queen emerged in tears, while Charles sat bewildered, confused, unable to consummate the union. The truth, though never publicly admitted, was devastating. Charles's reproductive organs were underdeveloped, infantile. Physicians would later write, he had neither the strength nor the maturity to function as a husband. But the court could never allow this truth to be spoken aloud. Instead, they turned the blame upon Marie-Louise herself. She was accused of barrenness. Physicians subjected her to humiliating examinations, invasive treatments, and endless rituals to cure her infertility. She was forced to drink concoctions of herbs, oils, and animal parts. Some treatments bordered on torture. The queen, once lively and spirited, withered into despair. In her letters to her family in France, she described herself as married to a ghost, and confessed that her days were filled with nothing but prayer and sorrow. In 1689, at just 26 years old, Marie-Louise died suddenly. The official report claimed appendicitis, but many whispered suicide, or worse, that the Spanish court had poisoned her to silence suspicion. For Charles, her death was another fracture in an already broken life. Yet the machinery of dynasty pressed on. Within months, he was remarried. His second wife was Maria Anna of Neuburg. Chosen from a German princely family known for fertility, her sisters had produced dozens of children. Surely, the court reasoned, she would succeed where Marie-Louise had failed. But again, the truth was undeniable. Charles was incapable. Maria Anna bore him no children. And like her predecessor, she endured humiliation and scorn as whispers of witchcraft and curses swirled through the palace. If medicine failed, Spain turned to the supernatural. And here, the story of Charles II enters its most disturbing chapter. Convinced that the king was the victim of sorcery, priests began a series of public exorcisms. These were no quiet prayers whispered in a chapel. They were theatrical spectacles, staged in the throne room itself, with nobles, courtiers, and even foreign ambassadors forced to watch. Imagine the scene. The King of Spain, ruler of an empire stretching across continents, writhing on the floor as priests shouted Latin incantations, pressed crucifixes against his skin, and forced him to swallow holy water laced with powdered relics. The liquid made him violently ill, and his vomiting was proclaimed as proof that demons were leaving his body. Charles, frail and terrified, believed it. One priest, Father Antonio Alvarez de Argales, declared that Charles was possessed by no fewer than 260,000 demons, a grotesque exaggeration, but one that spread across Europe. Foreign ambassadors, horrified, sent letters back home describing the spectacle as more disturbing than any torture chamber. To see the most powerful monarch in Europe treated like a child convulsing in terror was both pitiful and terrifying. But the priests did not stop with Charles himself. In 1698, Father Alvarez ordered a purification of the royal palace. Servants scoured every chamber, gathering objects believed to be contaminated by sorcery, gifts from foreign courts, jewelry, clothing, even furniture. All of it was carried into the courtyard and burned in massive pyres while priests chanted exorcisms. Smoke blackened the sky above Madrid. Citizens gathered in the streets, some convinced the palace was under siege, others certain that their king was battling hell itself. Charles, tragically, believed the rituals helped. His fragile mind, desperate for relief, clung to the priest's promises. After each exorcism, he would sometimes rally, smiling weakly, claiming to feel the demons leave his body. But the respite never lasted. Within days, his ailments returned, worse than before, and he would beg for more ceremonies. Over the last 5 years of his life, Charles endured more than 50 such exorcisms. Each one left him weaker, more broken, more convinced that his suffering was the work of devils. The truth, of course, was far crueler. There were no demons. There was only the relentless arithmetic of biology, centuries of inbreeding, collapsing into the body of one doomed man. And as Charles wasted away in the palace, the empire wasted away around him. Spain, once the master of Europe, had become a husk. Its king was pitiful, its armies weakened, its treasury drained. The court could no longer pretend. The Habsburg line in Spain was collapsing, and with it, the balance of power across the continent. The fate of Europe itself now hung on the question no priest or physician could answer. What would happen when the last Habsburg of Spain drew his final breath? By the final years of his reign, Charles II was little more than a shadow of a king. He was 35, but he looked like a sickly child stretched thin, his body hunched and wasted, his hair patchy, his skin pale and mottled with rashes. Courtiers wrote of a peculiar odor that seemed to follow him, strange, unsettling, as if his very flesh were rotting from within. He could barely walk without support, and his speech had deteriorated so much that even his closest attendants often guessed at his words. He lived in constant pain, and yet he clung desperately to life, haunted by the fear that demons would seize him if he let his guard down. Exorcisms became a grim ritual, repeated again and again, 50 times in 5 years. Priests dragged the broken king through spectacles of holy water, relics, and Latin chants. Each session left him weaker, and yet Charles demanded more. Convinced that salvation lay just one ceremony away, his palace had become a theater of horror, where the ruler of an empire writhed on the floor as nobles looked on in silence. By then, everyone knew the truth. Charles would produce no heir. His 2 marriages had ended in despair. Marie-Louise of Orléans had died at 26, broken by sorrow and humiliation. Maria Anna of Neuburg, though famed for her fertile family, remained childless. The Spanish Habsburg line, the line that had once ruled half the known world, was about to end with him. His death was not just a family tragedy. It was a geopolitical earthquake. For years, Europe's rulers had watched his decline with a predator's patience. France, Austria, England, the Dutch Republic, all waited for the moment the last Habsburg king of Spain would fall. Behind closed doors, diplomats drew up secret treaties, carving up Spain's empire in advance like vultures circling a carcass. On November 1, 1700, Charles II finally succumbed. He was 38 years old. His body, ravaged by disease and inbreeding, could endure no more. The autopsy confirmed what many had suspected. His organs were deformed beyond recognition. His heart was described as the size of a walnut. His lungs were filled with fluid. His intestines were rotting. His body was so corrupted that the physicians reportedly declared he had been dead many years before dying. With his death, the Habsburg dynasty in Spain was extinguished, and with it came chaos. The question of succession ignited the War of the Spanish Succession, one of the bloodiest conflicts Europe had ever seen. France and Austria clashed over who would inherit Spain's empire. England and the Dutch Republic joined in, determined to prevent Louis XIV of France from uniting 2 crowns. The war raged for over a decade, devastating Europe, killing hundreds of thousands, and redrawing the political map. Charles's broken body had become the spark that set the continent ablaze. The mightiest throne in Europe had been left empty by a king who could not eat, could not speak clearly, and could not father a child. And yet, his story is more than tragedy. It is a lesson written in bone and blood. The Habsburgs believed they could defy nature, that they could preserve their supremacy by locking their bloodline into an endless loop. They believed purity meant strength. Instead, it meant collapse. In Charles II, nature delivered its verdict. A dynasty that had ruled empires was reduced to a man who could not rule himself. The greatest irony of all was that Charles II, the so-called purist Habsburg, was also the most powerless. Centuries of carefully guarded marriages had produced a king who embodied not majesty but failure. His jaw, his body, his very existence were nature's condemnation of his family's arrogance. Today, when we stand before his portraits in museums, we see more than the face of a monarch. We see the consequences of human pride, the hubris of believing that power can bend biology to its will. His wide, sad eyes peer out from the canvas, an intelligence trapped in a body designed by centuries of human folly. Charles II's life was not just the end of a dynasty. It was a reminder that even the greatest empires are bound by the same laws as every living creature. Ignore those laws, and nature will have the last word. For Spain, for the Habsburgs, and for Charles himself, that word was written in a broken body, a cursed throne, and a dynasty that destroyed itself from within.